welcome back to our Business Agility vlog series. In the last vlog, you saw how customers can visualize the flow of value using Metronome. Now, let us see how teams can address the risks, what steps are and can be taken by teams to resolve them. I'm very excited to have Meers back with us. He is a national leader for data and analytics governance with RSM Global. Dan, can you please share with us how did your teams use the risk board in Metronome? How did they go in and capture the risks, as well as what about during execution of the program, right? When a new risk arised, right? How did they go and capture them in Metronome? Can you share with us?
Certainly, thank you, Raj. The key to Metronome and the change that it brought to our process is that the risk board is persistent. In the old days, we would, when we did a plan and a proposal, we would also do a risk register. And the register was developed so that we could make sure we left room in the plan and the resourcing to handle most of the risks that we could imagine occurring. However, risk registers tend to be static. Once they're captured, they kind of, we do them in the proposal, we kind of set them aside, and then we go on with execution. It's very difficult to use a risk register proactively throughout execution. But the risk board is persistent, it's present, it is consistently available to all of our skilled Agilists, and it has another value. Rather than putting a risk register in front of a client at the beginning, and then running a quality assurance surveillance program or something against that, which is latent. It tends to be after the fact, right? Oh, well, we've delivered this, but there was a problem. What the risks board does is keep the risks front and center so that we can review them and so that we remind the client of those risks and adjust them as we go forward. This helps us remain in a partnership mode, a collaborative mode with the client, so that we understand what some of the triggers might be that will expose us to those risks. We've had situations where in large programs, our scope changes. And there is often a willingness of customers to say, look, we need you, instead of just doing models, to, for example, actually help us test the model in our systems. Well, we can look at that. We had noted on our risk board that there was a risk that because we were delivering models but not helping you implement and test them, that you might have trouble doing that. And that might result in your being unable to verify the models are ready for your use. Since our program is around you being successful with the models, not just our delivery of them, we recognize that as a risk. Now you're suggesting that risk has been realized. You see it. You are triggering a risk for us in execution by asking for that change. Let's do two things. Let's revise our plans a little bit together and understand what it will take to do those things. Let's recognize in the risk board that that risk has been realized, right? And that that's going to have some effects. And then we need to watch for any blockers that occur as a result of the change in the nature of the work we're doing. We could have blockers around gaining access to your systems on a timely basis. We could have blockers arise as to the way the model gets implemented or the availability of test data. So now, again, we're proactively monitoring, tracking, communicating risks. We're doing it in a way that allows us to use the safe cycle to continue to orchestrate our backlog, our resources to address these proactively, rather than waiting for a failure and having to go back and correct. And all of the tools in Metronome give us the ability to do this in the open with the client.
This is fantastic. Just to reiterate what you just said, so you go into the risk board during your planning session. That's when you go and capture as all the risks that you can. So and later, as the teams start executing the program, during your daily stand-up and during ceremonies like daily stand-up, Scrum of Scrum, that's when the blockers could pop up. And as the teams go in and start addressing these impediments or blockers, they realize that there's a risk to the execution of the program. They can go back, revisit the risk board, and they can enter these risks. And not only that, they can share it with their customer, right? It's all about transparency, right, in the Agile world. So they can use the risk board to communicate and share with the customer on where they are addressing all these risks to their program, right?
Yes, and it's absolutely pivotal to us because in our world, as a consultant, what we cannot have is a risk situation where we are green one day and we go directly to red. We have to be able to say, we see it starting to occur, we go from green to yellow, and we can work back to green. But anytime you go from green to red, it would suggest that your plan was incomplete, your resources aren't correct, something of that nature, right? So what we've learned to do is we track the risk in the risk board. We update them. When a risk is realized, let's say that we lose that sponsor or reviewer who has to approve our deliverables and a new one has to come in. We see that risk, we update it on the risk board, and the first question we ask, is that a blocker? Are there other actions we need to take to mitigate that risk? Again, we just went yellow, we just recognized that a risk moment has occurred, a risk has been realized. We now have an extended review cycle because we have a new person who hasn't done this with us and we haven't built that process together. And each reviewer, as you know, can operate differently with in these situations. So what we do is we say, oh, there are additional activities, there's a story we need to write and we need to prioritize that says, orient the new reviewer, do a walkthrough, be prepared to make the review go well. And so we go from yellow, recognizing that, we come back to green because we prioritize a new story, we get the agreement with the client because they see the risk and agree. It's very easy using the risk board to drive an agreement around that change.
Thank you. Thank you for reminding me about the red, yellow, green. So within Metronome, we have this ability to view your risk as a matrix, right? And classify the risk based on their severity and likelihood of occurrence. And that I think is very powerful because you have your red, yellow, green visibility of risks, right? You can go in and see how these risks are being classified and address those risks that are definitely more likely to occur as well as that have a greater impact of occurrence. Right?
That's exactly right, because what we're saying to the customer with this is, this has an increasingly high likelihood of occurrence now, and it's very impactful. And that means that we are being careful not to escalate all risks to the client, because low impact risk they expect us to handle, or we should be able to work past. But if it has a high impact, then they want to know about it. So it's very much about materiality for us. And when you are able to focus on those things, then they are willing to take actions to help you mitigate them because they agree on the importance.
Thank you so much for your time, Dan. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Now, let us see how Dan and his team can leverage Metronome to add those risks directly to the risk board, not only during planning, but also during execution as unknown risks surface. Let us also see some of the graphical indicators in Metronome that help Dan's teams visualize those risk visuals that are important to note. Teams can go in and access the program board during the 2-day PI planning event. And this is where they would add features and stories and commit to those stories. Now, as they start doing this planning process, they might identify risks. Now, in order to add those risks, they would just click on this risk tab and access the risk board. Now, let's say there was an integration that we were trying to develop, and due to the technology we are using, there's perhaps a risk to the implementation of this integration, right? We can go in and identify that here. We can own the risk. We can also assign a risk owner. We can indicate the severity of this risk and also indicate the likelihood of its occurrence. When we click on submit, right, this risk is now added to the risk board. You also have this matrix view, this ability for teams to go in and visualize these risks based on the likelihood and severity of occurrence. Now, this is a very powerful view because it helps teams focus on those risks that are most likely to occur and have a severe impact. Now, let us see what happens during the execution of the program increment. When your iteration execution is started during ceremonies like daily stand-up, teams go in and access their Kanban board. This is where they would see all the stories and tasks that they are implementing. Now, as they are implementing this particular task, let us say they encountered a blocker or an impediment that prevented them from implementing this task. Now, they can elevate this task as a blocker. Perhaps they can say there's a shortage of resource, right? Now notice what happens. Metronome asks you, because this task has been elevated as a blocker, does this add a risk to the program increment? Right? So that takes us directly to the risk board, where you can go in and identify the risk. Not only that, right? Let's see what happens to our program board. Notice that this story is now blocked. Now we don't stop right there. As I hover over the story, right, Metronome shows you that all those stories and features that are dependent on this story are also blocked. Now in this way, with the help of the powerful program board and the risk board, Metronome helps teams visualize and communicate the progress and ensure that there's transparency, which are the key elements for a successful Agile implementation.